I'm Michael Collins. I'm with Jobs for the Future. I'm a vice president. I lead our Center for Racial Economic Equity, and just really honored to be on the stage with some incredible journalists. We have Lauren Gurley for The Post, Catherine Gill, Wall Street Journal, and Emma Goldberg with the New York Times. And I'm going to jump right in and ask if they would do an intro, tell us kind of what you cover, and then we'll get into a set of questions about kind of some of the trends that they are seeing in work. So why don't we start here?
Cool. Thank you so much, Michael.
Sure.
Really appreciate it, and I'm honored to be here with some very excellent reporters. My name is Lauren Gurley. I cover labor for the Washington Post, so mostly labor unions, the labor movement, the economic forces that shape workers' lives. I mostly focus on blue-collar workers, so frontline workers, people in lower wage jobs, as opposed to white-collar workers. And right now I'm spending a lot of time covering the intersection between that and the election.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for having us here. As journalists, it's fun to be on the other side of the question asking, sort of. And I am Emma Goldberg. I'm at the New York Times. I cover the culture of work, which I think about as the way the workplace is changing because of new technologies, because of economic change, because of political and social change, and how that affects workers' lives and communities around the country.
I'm Catherine Dill. I'm an editor at the Wall Street Journal, and I've covered management and the workforce for the better part of a decade at a number of publications, including the Journal, and now I also oversee news programming for the Future of Everything Festival, which is the Journal's largest live event, at which we also look at the future of work. And so it's always an exciting time, I think, to be covering work, particularly through a variety of different lenses, and certainly now maybe even more so than others.
Awesome. Well, we have a great conversation lined up, and I'm going to just get into it. Kate, I want to start with you, and I'd like to start with kind of some of the most surprising trends that you have observed, and you can go a few years back. So, like in the last few years, what are some of the most surprising trends?
Sure. I mean, I think the most interesting thing happening right now is that we're sort of seeing the durability or lack thereof of a lot of things that people got really excited about during the pandemic. You know, you may have read an article or two about quiet quitting, and I apologize that I may have written several of them. But, you know, I think we're starting to get to see some things bear out in terms of, was this like an extraordinary, you know, once in a modern economy, you know, hype cycle event, never to be repeated, and, you know, during which unprecedented gains were made, or was this a lot of different granular changes based on the historic event that was happening in the background? I would argue, I think that much of it was the latter, and now we're sort of starting to see what happens next for people. You know, was there major transformation in terms of we're all working remotely, and so that means that, you know, mothers everywhere are as supported as they need to be in their work, and maybe that's not exactly what happened. And so anyway, I think it's a sort of exciting time. This is a long-winded way of saying I think it's a sort of exciting time right now to take a look at the things that we were writing 4 and 5 articles a week about back in 2021 and 2022 and see where they actually got us. And I apologize that now you're going to start reading the term the big stay.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. Trends, and it's interesting, as you were talking, and you know, you cover the culture of work. There are lots of ways that work is changing and the way our mental models about work, so I want to come back to that too. But first, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about trends you've seen.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's something that I feel like we hear and say a lot, that we're living in historic times, which it certainly feels that way after the last week or 10 days or whatever amount of time has passed. But I feel like also part of it is that we're all processing everything that's happening to us so speedily in real time and with constant input from everyone around us. And I think about that a lot when I'm thinking about covering the workplace and looking for different worker perspectives, because we're all in a really unique place as workforce journalists in a moment when social media allows workers to process and react in real time to changes in the economy and to changes in corporate policies. And so I sometimes try and think about like looking at some of the dominant narratives that emerge and then also trying to sort of peel back those labels and talk to a lot of different workers about what those kind of narratives and meta labels feel like on an individual level. Because, for example, we were all talking a lot about the Great Resignation for a long time. There was 40 million people quitting their jobs, 50 million people, and there was an immediate and instinctual reaction to that, which was like, nobody wants to work anymore. And that was the way that like Kim Kardashian put it. Or there were all these signs in the windows of like McDonald's saying like, we really need workers because nobody wants to work anymore. When in reality, when you dug into the economic data, there was like an almost one-to-one correlation between people quitting their jobs and swapping jobs. And there was a lot of movement in between industries. There was a lot of fluctuation on wages. There was like, really harried attempts to try and get wages to keep pace with inflation. So I think that part of our job as journalists is to look for what are all of the narratives that are surfacing on social media and in conversation, and then how can we like kind of unpack those narratives or open up the packages under the labels and see what are people's actual experiences.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I can't imagine you all keeping up with it, because us reading it and trying to keep up with the different, it's like the volume is incredible. So I do have some questions about how you do that, but let's give you an opportunity. Trends over the last 3 years that you've seen.
Yeah, so I think what's been extremely astounding, and if you talk to labor economists in Washington or labor policy people in Washington, the thing that they consistently talk about is how incredible the labor market recovery was after the pandemic compared to the 2008 recession. I think it took a little over 2 years to recover all the job losses, the 22 million jobs that were lost during COVID. It took around over 6 years to do that after 2008. And so you have this really tight labor market. Everyone keeps talking about record low unemployment. The unemployment rate as of April, I think, was below 4% for the 27th consecutive month, which hasn't happened since the Vietnam War draft in the late 60s, early 70s. Black unemployment rate last year hit a record low, I think at 4.7%. Some of that has softened since then, but I think there's a big disconnect between all of that data and what we hear when we talk to workers, especially what I hear when I talk to low-wage workers, frontline workers, who may have recently switched jobs, may have, been part of the Great Resignation and found a better paying job, but are still being just like really heavily hit by inflation, by really high price of gas, of food, of childcare, of housing. And so I think that disconnect has sort of been a big theme in thinking about the labor market, especially lower wage workers who have seen extraordinary wage gains, even outpacing inflation. I think about 12% between 2019 and 2023, one of the sort of biggest periods of wage growth for the lower end of the labor market, basically in decades, but yet people are not entirely happy. So
I appreciate you kind of raising that, because part of like when I'm reading your work, right? In some ways, I think that we are all guilty of like when we're accused in some ways of being kind of elites, right? Like when I'm reading your work, sometimes I wonder how it touches down on the ground. And when we were prepping for this, we talked about like, well, how can workforce experts better support you? And you were mentioning getting close to people, and so you were mentioning people. So I'd just be curious about that. Like, so in your work, how you're processing all this information, all this data. How do you kind of connect with people who are living and experiencing that? So I'd love maybe Kate, you start off.
Yeah. No, that's the most important part, I think, always of workforce stories. I mean, workforce is such a thrilling beat because you can get ideas from like the person you're talking to in line at the grocery store, from your friends at dinner, or from these like giant tranches of, government data. Like the actual germ of a story can come from anywhere. But you really don't know, I feel, what's going on until you talk to actual rank and file workers. So I think most often in my experience, it's like you kind of think the story is this, and then once you talk to a whole bunch of workers, you realize it's actually more like this, and then you'll talk to one who will help you see that it's like this, and you don't really have it until you've had those conversations, and it's very easy to when you talk about elites, like it's really easy to get lots of experts and consultants and academics and executives on the phone. But getting to talk to rank and file workers is often really challenging, especially when you consider that, at the Wall Street Journal, and I know standards are similar, among our peers, we make people go on the record with their first and last names and tell us what's going on at their employer. And then at the Journal, under our no surprises policy, we call their employer before the story publishes and say, Susan said that you made her work 15 hours yesterday. I just don't want you to be surprised when that's in the paper. And then Susan gets to go to work the next day. So there's this incredible sort of, the stakes are really high for just regular people to tell us what their actual experiences are. And so in the way that people can be helpful, I think that, experts and intermediaries can be really helpful is helping us tap those networks of workers who can talk to us about what's actually happening for them, and as Emma so aptly said, sort of like open the packages under those labels.
Yeah, anything to add there? I'm gonna, go ahead, Emma.
I would just add that also as a reporter, I want to be like surprised in the course of conversations, and I find that like the emotional register of how people speak about different workforce issues is just so different when you walk into a room with a business executive versus anyone who works for them. And I found this in particular in covering AI and automation because, I've gone to conferences or had meetings with startups where just the hype around AI is through the roof. And you hear like all the promises about the productivity it's going to unlock, the jobs it's going to create. But I find with so many of the workers that I speak with, there's a lot of anxiety, like there's a lot of concern about what it's going to mean for people's jobs. And I think about this in particular for people who don't necessarily feel like they're being connected with the training or the retraining to be able to adapt or switch into different roles. I've written about like call center workers, for example, who have a lot of concern that when they work with chatbots in the course of conversations with customers, they feel like they're training their own replacements. So I think that to me, like as a workforce reporter, and I know from reading both of your reporting that we want to know like what the real emotional register around workforce issues is, and we're going to get a really different story when we talk with the people who are experiencing it, and not just the top decision makers who are maybe biased because they've already made the decision to go ahead with whatever we're writing about. So I think it's part of our like due diligence and our responsibility to want to hear the full story.
I love that you actually kind of segued us all to AI. That was it's obviously another trend. Definitely want to hear more about that. And maybe Lauren, do you want to, I'd be curious, like AI kind of in your work in trends.
Yeah, so maybe not the best to talk to because blue-collar workers, like currently, are probably some of the least impacted by AI, maybe besides call centers and customer service. But a lot of front-facing blue-collar jobs are not sort of being displaced as right now by AI. I think what I am carefully watching, though, is that what happens to the white-collar jobs that are lost? Where do those people go? Do they move up or do they move down? And I think a lot of what we'll probably see is downward mobility for people who lose sort of the white-collar low-skilled office jobs to moving into service jobs, moving into the gig economy. So that's something I'm paying close attention to. I think I'll just talk about this briefly because it's not really on the point of the question, but what I do see a lot of is the rollout of automation impacting frontline workers right now. Like you walk into any hotel, restaurant, retail store, grocery store, and there are just far fewer workers right now than there were before the pandemic staffing that store. And part of that is a cost-cutting measure, but part of that is also, how companies are grappling with labor shortages. You could look at it in different ways. So I think, I've heard from union leaders that they've lost 300,000 members to self-checkout in grocery retailers over the past decade or so. So there's a lot of people being displaced, and it's interesting to see where they're going.
I'm curious, Kate. So job creation, job disruption. The journal, covers. Thoughts there?
One of the things I've noticed is that I think we're finally starting to see some more interesting examples of AI at work. I sort of joke, it's like we are living through the job destruction and sort of deep fake era of the onset of AI, and it's like I'm waiting for the cancer curing and great works of art era of AI. But we had a story recently by one of my colleagues in which a doctor talked about using ambient scribe technology and how it had, there's all these doctors retiring early, leaving the profession because the digital charting is so onerous. It was supposed to be so helpful. It's proven so onerous that it's ended a lot of medical careers. And the ambient scribe technology sort of fixed all of that. And they were able to just focus on the patient, knowing that this tool was collecting all of this digital information. And the quote in the story was, "I can look in my patient's eyes again." And I thought, okay, this is exciting, because a year ago we were just drowning, or I'm sure both of you were just drowning in pitches about life-changing technology. Every last piece of it was a chatbot. And so I think that it feels like we are, the hype cycle has cooled. There's some more skepticism on the scene, but we're also moving into a lot more granular, interesting examples of how AI is going to affect people's work.
This is cruel and unusual because there's no way we're going to cover everything that we need to cover here. But I have to ask the question. So JFF, we have a North Star that's 75 million people facing systemic barriers will be in quality jobs in the next 10 years. And so a lot of the conversation that we've been having is around skills first hiring versus kind of traditional degrees. And I'm just wondering how that kind of shows up kind of in some of your work. So Emma, maybe we start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think there are just, the interesting thing about the moment that we're in right now is that so much is in flux in the workplace. And it's kind of astounding trying to take stock of all of it, like the shift to remote and hybrid work, which for decades was completely unimaginable. And then all of a sudden we woke up one day and decided we could figure out how to remake our workplaces so that many millions of workers spend a couple of days working from home and benefit from the flexibility that brings. AI, as we've said, there's a recent estimate that about AI could automate the equivalent of up to 300 million full-time jobs in the coming years. That was the Goldman Sachs estimate. So there's kind of all of these massive changes that are remaking the workplace. And I think what that's doing is it's giving an invitation to employers to start questioning the way that they've always done things, whether that's hiring processes, like the types of qualifications that they consider required, or how they're going about doing their recruiting. And so there's a lot of challenge here, there's a lot of risk to workers, but there's also the opportunity to be much more imaginative for employers about closing some really long-standing inequalities in the workplace and thinking about how to broaden their hiring pools. And I think that definitely opens, opportunities to hire for workers who maybe don't come from as traditional backgrounds. And I've talked with a lot of companies who are thinking about how do they remake their hiring processes so that they reach a broader pool of workers and workers with a broader pool of educational backgrounds. And there's companies that are doing really wonderful work around that, including IBM, including Starbucks, which, also a lot of challenges and a lot of challenges Starbucks is seeing in terms of how they're responding to the union campaign. So there's both upside and downside, but they're doing some really creative things around hiring and trying to reach workers from non-traditional backgrounds. So I think the kind of bottom line here is that because there's been such massive change, there's also real opportunities to start questioning the way things were always done. And that's particularly true where it comes to hiring and reaching workers from non-traditional backgrounds.
I'm curious, Lauren, your thoughts, because presumably the skills first would help kind of some of the populations that you write a lot about.
Sure, totally. Yeah, so because of labor shortages, you've seen a lot of employers move away from college degree requirements in their job postings, even in blue-collar jobs. Last summer, I went to Mankato, Minnesota. Minnesota had hit the lowest unemployment rate on record for any state in like all history or something. I forget, it was like 1.9%. And then I found the like town in Minnesota that had the lowest unemployment rate out of all of the major cities in Minnesota. And it was like 1.2% unemployment. And all of the employers there were, there's a lot of industry there, food manufacturing, some big companies, some big tech companies too, and everyone was sort of just rushing to figure out how to get disabled workers, tap into new immigrant communities that had traditionally been excluded. Obviously raising wages a lot, but for lower wage jobs, abandoning a lot of the requirements that they used to have and just doing everything they could to move into new labor pools. Particularly, there's a big Somali population, so figuring out ways to appeal more to the Somali workers and also younger workers. I was talking to like people who had their first job in an ice cream shop. This isn't skills-based required job, but they were making like $24 an hour. So
Yeah.
that was incredible. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up population. This is the last trend we're going to be able to cover because we got to go to our questioning audience. I'd be remiss if I didn't focus on, you mentioned the Somali population, so population-specific work. So 2020, coverage about kind of labor market inequality, racial discrimination. We're in a different place today, but in the papers, given the Supreme Court's kind of striking down of affirmative action, the Attorney General's kind of letter to Fortune 100 CEOs that you are not to use kind of race as a basis of hiring. How is that showing up kind of in your work and in the labor market, kind of DEI, anti-DEI? How is that coming up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I haven't personally. I'll be interested to hear what my colleagues here have to say. I haven't seen the results appear just yet. I've seen the sort of onset of anxiety and confusion. But I think the other thing, and this sort of dovetails with what we were talking about in terms of skills-based hiring, is that there are a lot of barriers, many of them technological, that prevent us from creating more diverse workforces all the time that aren't necessarily about checking a box associated with race or ethnicity. It can be something like a resume gap. It can be a whole variety of things that fall into these technological funnels and keep people out of good work for which they're entirely qualified. And so I think that we're certainly going to see the effects of a lot of these like very direct measures, but the workforce and hiring managers and people who want to build diverse pipelines were already grappling with a lot of challenges that were still in place anyway.
Yeah, Emma, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think really coming out of every recent Supreme Court session, there's just been immense political and legal uncertainty about what some of the decisions mean for employers. I was working for the past couple of months on a story about how employers are feeling in this moment of seeing the public attacks on DEI programs. And I think what a lot of them are feeling is that they really don't know exactly what it means for them, but that uncertainty in itself puts them in a challenging position. Because we've already seen, for example, law firms whose affirmative action programs have faced lawsuits. And so we've seen law firms who decide to shut down or to kind of change the requirements around some of their fellowships that are supposed to promote hiring and recruitment of candidates from all different racial backgrounds. And so what that means is that even law firms that aren't facing lawsuits might decide to shut down their fellowships or to change the rules because they don't know what the future is going to look like for them. So I think overall, we're still in this moment of so much flux. We're still in the moment where we're seeing a lot of threats just beginning to emerge, but employers are trying to kind of scramble and react and get ahead of the curve. And what that means can be that workers experience the challenge, experience kind of the results of the threat and the backlash, even before we see the writing on the wall of exactly what it all means.
Awesome. So I'm gonna close this out with the trends that you kind of see coming up, and so I'm gonna prime you a bit though. So Lauren, I'd love, like, as you think about kind of the population that you're writing about, like, what are some of the things that you think we'll be seeing, and then on the culture, like, help us think about the way that work is changing, and then we want to close out with the big stay.
Great. Yeah, so I am really closely tracking this boom in clean energy jobs. I think there's been $360 billion from the IRA invested over the past 2 years in hundreds and hundreds of projects that are popping up all over the country. And I think the Biden administration is this is sort of like a marquee project for him to rebuild the middle class and create good paying union jobs. I think there's a huge question mark as to whether those will be good paying union jobs, because the implementation of it is rolling out right now. And from what I'm hearing on the ground, not all of these jobs pay well, and not all of them are going to union members. In fact, most of them are not. And there's all this sort of really complex requirements to see that the Treasury Department has set for developers to get these tax credits, which some companies are finding there are loopholes and ways around them. So that's one thing that I am watching very closely. And then the other thing I'm watching is sort of what is going to happen to the labor market. So I talked about how the labor market is extraordinarily strong, one of the best labor markets we've seen in decades. It's starting to cool, and when labor markets start to cool, the first workers that are impacted are the most vulnerable in the labor market. It's African American workers, women, younger workers, workers with disabilities. And these workers have really sort of gained some leverage in the labor market over the past few years. So I'm curious how much of that they're able to hold on to, or whether a lot of that just goes away if the labor market cools, or if we can continue sort of these big wage gains and movement that lower wage people have had in the labor market.
Thank you, Lauren. Emma.
In terms of the changing culture of the workplace, kind of two trends that I'm tracking closely. One is the kind of lingering effects of the upsurge of worker power, right? So even though union representation in the country remains low, popular sentiment toward unions is the highest it's been in many years. And we're seeing unionization campaigns across workplaces that hadn't previously been unionized. And we're also seeing interesting kind of pockets of solidarity and alliance between white-collar and blue-collar workers in some of these workplaces. So for example, at Amazon, when corporate workers walked out of headquarters protesting return to office requirements, there was actually shows of support from some workers in warehouses who had been doing their own organizing with the thought that when workers in one kind of pocket of the economy or industry can organize, they can also kind of extend the benefits to other parts of the economy or other parts of industry. And I think that's an interesting trend to kind of keep an eye on as we're continuing to question what are the lingering effects of the worker power upsurge. And the other one is that the number one thing I hear from workers that I speak with is that they just want a seat at the table in what feels like a moment of tumult and flux for them. So that, we saw at the moment when employers were trying to call workers back to the office, there were so many perks that were kind of thrown at the wall. There were free bagels, there were free tacos, there was was pizza. I could just go down the whole menu. But what a lot of workers wanted was a lot more nuance than that. Some of them wanted increased fertility benefits. Some of them wanted more bereavement leave. Some of them wanted just simply, flexible hours so that they could go pick their kids up in the afternoon and then log on in the evening and put in a few more hours after the traditional workday. So I just heard from so many workers that they wanted a say in what benefits were coming out of this period of tumult.
Thanks so much. Kate, close out.
So the big stay, I mean, this just falls into sort of like the tyranny of everything needs to have like a catchy phrase now, which newspapers have had nothing to do with perpetuating. But so, Emma talked before about the Great Resignation and how, oh my God, all these people are leaving their jobs and it's because they don't want to work. And it's like, no, they're getting different jobs. Like, it's very simple. Like they're going out and saying, I could have basically the same job, earn X percentage more, and not be at the place where I spent the pandemic. Done. Here I am. And now, of course, the market is cooling. We're seeing a lot less churn, a lot less job changing, and all of the factors that drive that have cooled as well. We're not seeing these huge wage bumps for changing roles at similar organizations and things like that. And so people are remaining in their current positions. I sort of don't think that this is anything necessarily to be alarmed or concerned by or curious about. I mean, we're talking about a relatively short period of time that all of this tumult has occurred over. Previously it would not have been uncommon to remain in the same job for 3 years. I mean, really, we're talking about a period of 3 years here. And so I think there's probably going to be a lot of talk about, is it the 1950s again? Are we seeing people who are going to spend their whole careers at a single organization? And I think we're just seeing people live out this period of sort of uncertainty where they're, figuring out what their company's hybrid policy looks like, if they have one. They're waiting out, what's going to happen in the economy and with inflation and housing. And so they just haven't moved jobs this year. But we're going to find a cute way to talk about it.